Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most complex, defining, and frankly astonishing conflicts of the 20th century. We're talking about a historical event of a truly epic scale, a conflict that completely reshaped global geopolitics, fractured societies, and literally redefined modern warfare forever.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this right here is the central paradox we're exploring today. How on earth did a small agrarian nation with absolutely no heavy industry manage to hold off and ultimately defeat the greatest economic and military superpower on the planet? To figure that out, we have to trace this conflict all the way back to its roots.
So here is a roadmap. Number 1, the ant versus the elephant. Number 2, end of French Indochina. Number 3, a nation divided. Number 4, the American escalation. Number 5, the turning point. And finally, number 6, withdrawal and legacy. Just to break down this really dense century of history into a clear, logical structure for us.
All right, starting with section 1, the ant versus the elephant. Because to really understand this conflict, we first have to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the mismatch between these two nations back in the 1950s and 60s.
Look at this massive disparity. On one side, you've got the United States. They were producing roughly a quarter of the entire world's industrial output. We're talking about an economic titan with immense wealth and cutting-edge military tech. And on the other side, Vietnam, a largely agrarian economy where about 90% of the population relied on farming. There were practically no heavy industries at all. The historical sources literally describe this dynamic as a fight between an ant and an elephant.
And wow, did the elephant bring its full weight to bear? 7 million tons. That is the actual amount of bombs the United States dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia during this conflict. To put that massive number into perspective for you, that's more than all the non-atomic bombs dropped by all sides in all of World War II combined. It's staggering. So you have to ask, how did the ant even survive this unimaginable level of bombardment?
Let's move to section 2, end of French Indochina. Because to understand the American War, we absolutely have to look at the colonizers who were there first. You see, this wasn't a new fight for the Vietnamese. Going back to 1858, French colonization began, forcibly taking land and essentially turning the Vietnamese people into laborers in their own country. Decades of this harsh rule and heavy taxation sparked a relentless drive for independence, and that movement found its leader in Ho Chi Minh, who formed the Viet Minh in 1941. Fast forward to the end of World War II in 1945, when occupying Japanese forces surrendered, Ho Chi Minh actually declared Vietnam an independent nation. But the French just flat out refused to let their colony go, which triggered a brutal 9-year war.
That colonial war ultimately culminated in the 1954 Battle of Dien. The French had positioned their forces down in a valley, assuming they'd just easily outgun the Vietnamese. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer willpower behind General Giap's strategy. He knew he couldn't win a conventional battle, so his forces completely dismantled their heavy artillery. Then an astonishing 250,000 civilians, everyday men and women, carried those weapon parts by hand, piece by piece, up the steep mountains surrounding that valley. They reassembled them at the very top and just bombarded the trapped French forces, forcing a totally shocking surrender. The ant had officially defeated its first elephant.
Which brings us to section 3, a nation divided. The end of French rule definitely didn't bring peace. Instead, it set up a new geopolitical chessboard that would pull the United States directly into the jungle.
Here's the thing. The US wasn't there fighting for colonization. They were fighting an ideology. The core motivation was this concept called the domino theory. We're in the Cold War era, right? And the US is operating on a strict policy of containment. Their ultimate fear was that if one nation, like Vietnam, fell to Soviet and Chinese-backed communism, neighboring countries in Southeast Asia would inevitably topple one after the other, literally just like a row of dominoes. So the 1954 Geneva Accords temporarily split the country right at the 17th parallel. You had the North, which was communist, backed by the USSR and China, and led by the incredibly popular Ho Chi Minh. And then you had the South, heavily backed by the US and led by an anti-communist named Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, the Accords actually promised nationwide elections in 1956 to reunite the country, but Diem, with the backing of the US, refused to hold those elections. Why? Because they knew Ho Chi Minh would win in an absolute landslide. And that refusal basically guaranteed the conflict would carry on.
Moving into Section 4, the American escalation. With those elections blocked and Southern guerrilla fighters, who became known as the Viet Cong, rebelling against Diem's deeply corrupt government, a local conflict rapidly snowballed into a massive American military commitment.
The major catalyst for this escalation hit in August 1964,
After some highly confusing and heavily disputed reports of North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacking U.S. naval ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So the crucial point is this. It essentially gave President Lyndon B. Johnson a blank check to use military force in Southeast Asia without ever officially declaring war. The floodgates were officially open.
And those floodgates unleashed a massive tidal wave of manpower. Early in 1965, LBJ promised he wouldn't send American boys to fight a war thousands of miles away. But by the end of that exact same year, there were 185,000 U.S. combat troops in Vietnam. By 1967, it jumped to 485,000, and by 1968, it peaked at over 500,000 soldiers on the ground. But despite pouring all of these troops and resources into the region, a decisive victory remained completely out of reach.
This takes us to Section 5, the turning point. Because conventional military tactics simply were not working against a guerrilla enemy that could just blend right into the dense jungles and local populations.
To literally strip away the enemy's hiding spots, the U.S. military resorted to incredibly brutal tactics. They heavily utilized chemical defoliants, the most notorious being Agent Orange. This highly toxic chemical was sprayed across millions of acres to destroy the thick jungle canopy and food crops. But it didn't just devastate the environment. It caused horrific multi-generational health issues, rare cancers, and severe birth defects for the Vietnamese people, as well as the American soldiers who were exposed to it. The use of napalm also caused unimaginable civilian suffering, which severely damaged the moral high ground the U.S. claimed to hold.
Meanwhile, back on the American home front, these brutal realities were playing out on the evening news every single night. Remember, this was the first fully televised war in history. Seeing the sheer horror of the conflict, combined with a highly unequal draft system where wealthy and connected guys could easily avoid service, while lower-income and minority citizens were sent off to fight, well, it deeply fractured American society. The public violently split into two distinct camps. You had the hawks, who wanted to escalate military involvement to secure a win, and the doves, who protested in the millions, demanding an immediate peace settlement and complete withdrawal. And then we hit January 1968. Right during the Vietnamese New Year holiday, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive. This was a massive, highly coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities and outposts all across South Vietnam, even breaching the heavily fortified walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Now, militarily speaking, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces did eventually repel the attack, inflicting really heavy casualties on the North, but this brilliantly illustrates the psychological impact of the war, because it was a devastating blow. American military leaders had been telling the public for months that the enemy was weak and the war was almost over. The sheer scale of the Tet Offensive proved that was completely false, and it entirely broke American morale and public trust. Let's transition to Section 6, Withdrawal and Legacy. Now we're entering our final chapter, exploring the incredibly messy exit and the devastating aftermath left behind by this conflict. By 1969, the newly elected president, Richard Nixon, knew he had to get America out of this quagmire. So he introduced a policy called Vietnamization. The whole idea was to gradually withdraw American combat troops while simultaneously training and transferring the entire burden of the ground war over to the South Vietnamese army. But there was a catch. While he was pulling troops out, Nixon was also secretly expanding the intense bombing campaigns into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, which just sparked even more massive, widespread protests back home.
Let's move to and see how this builds toward the final collapse, because it happened incredibly fast. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, conclusively proving to the public that the government had been lying about the war's progress for years. By January 1973, facing immense domestic pressure, the U.S. finally signed the Paris Peace Accords, and by March, the very last American combat troops left Vietnam. But without that American military support, the South Vietnamese army just couldn't hold on. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled right into the capital, marking the fall of Saigon and the complete reunification of Vietnam under communist rule.
The human cost of this conflict is almost impossible to fully comprehend. For the United States, the war claimed the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers, leaving deep, lasting scars on an entire generation.
And meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the devastation was practically apocalyptic. It's estimated that over 3 million Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian soldiers and civilians perished. Millions more were completely displaced, and their homeland was left poisoned and heavily cratered by years of relentless bombings.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. The entire justification for this unimaginable human tragedy was the domino theory, that absolute certainty that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Asia would just follow. Well, Vietnam did become communist, but the dominoes didn't fall. The rest of Southeast Asia did not collapse into a monolithic communist bloc. It forces us to look back and ask, was it worth it? How did so many brilliant leaders get it so horribly wrong, and at what cost? Definitely something to think about as you reflect on this explainer. Thank you so much for learning with us today.